Hello, and welcome to Lost in Translation, where we explore yesterday to understand what is happening in the world today. My name is Simone, and I will be your host. Today, our topic is the Federal Reserve System and how their policies are creating hyperinflation. Higher inflation is not transitory, as many of our politicians have insisted over the last year. This presentation will include a document that was created by the United States Congressional Committees. This document confirms my assertions about the Federal Reserve System. This report was generated in 1976, right after our country went off the gold standard, and some of our leaders realized that our nation had been stolen from the people and that it was now completely owned by foreign powers. First, a little background on the Fed. World leaders and financial institutions are blaming inflation on the war in the Ukraine. At the same time, they are calling on the Federal Reserve and other central banks to do their jobs and curb inflation. This is a con and a lie. Here's why. The Federal Reserve System is the cause of the inflation. Their job as a privately owned central bank is to make a profit for their owners, meaning the Pope, who owns the City of London, and the Rothschild criminal banking cartel. It is through the same illegal practices of planned inflation and market collapse that this group of criminals owns 85% of the world's debt. Not just the debt, but most of the world's wealth is held by these bankers or someone related to them. Again, for my new listeners, the Federal Reserve is a privately owned bank that controls the United States, its currency, and its government since 1871. If you look at their website, the Federal Reserve was supposedly put in place to curb inflation and prevent market crashes. And what a surprise! There have been at least 5 market crashes just in my lifetime. After every market crash, the public loses everything, then the Fed gets everything. It has taken over 150 years, but every asset in America is hypothecated to a foreign bank. I am quoting Bill Clinton on that previous statement. Just as an example of how these foreign bankers gain control, the government says the inflation rate is between 7 and 8%, but this does not include fuel, food, or housing. So the real inflation rate is over 20%. And we know that our leaders understand the true inflation numbers because last week politicians gave themselves a 20% pay raise. Why, if inflation is at 20%, is the Fed only increasing the rate by 0.25%? Because they know this will cause inflation and eventual collapse in the market. Not just market collapse, but food shortages where many consumers will not be able to afford to buy food. This strategy of enslaving people with tax debt goes back thousands of years and is the way the Roman Empire survived for so long, and the European empires used their serf-slave system in the same way. The politicians created the debt for the banks to keep the slaves, us, in their places. That's the Federal Reserve's job. Then the bankers benefit when the debt bubble collapses. Anytime you print money from air, it devalues the currency. This is what has been and is happening today to cause inflation. It's the Fed printing money. Just to confirm this, let's check in with Gregory, a Wall Street expert, to outline what the Fed will have to do to curb inflation. If they really wanted to curb inflation, the Fed would have to do much, much more than raising rates. First off, the Fed would have to raise the benchmark higher rate than the current rate of inflation. Moreover, the Fed would have to drastically cut back on its asset purchases. Currently, in today's case, the Fed is currently buying $80 billion worth of Treasury securities and $40 billion of mortgage-backed bonds each month. This is taken directly from the Federal Reserve's own website. They are buying their own debt. They are not going to stop. In addition, for the Fed to slow rising inflation, they would have to unwind their balance sheet. That means they would have to sell the debt on their balance sheet. And that is definitely not happening. But that is not the only concern people should have about the Fed's actions. Market conditions are exposing other harsh realities. For instance, at the beginning of April, the Treasury yields, which retreated earlier in the week as portfolio adjustments boosted demand for bonds, spiked again on Friday, causing a closely watched part of the yield curve to invert for the third time in 1 week. An inversion of the yield curve, when shorter dated yields rise above longer dated ones, is seen as a harbinger of a recession in the next 1 to 2 years. Mind you, I am reading this news directly from Reuters News, who is owned by and located in the City of London, the home of the Federal Reserve. Let's explore the concepts of indicators of a recession. Some may recall about 18 months before the world lockdown from COVID, there was a 10-2 inversion curve in the bond market. That means the yield on the 10-year bond was less than the yield on the 2-year bond. Inversion curves like this preceded every recession in modern history, like the Great Depression and every other recession that we've experienced in the United States in my lifetime. The stock market is a derivative of the bond market, so this inversion curve generally indicates major trouble ahead. But this year's inflation is nothing today compared to what is coming in the near future. What our leaders are not telling us is that the Bank of England, who owns the Federal Reserve, went broke in March of 2019. The same day the whole world locked down for the flu. A worldwide lockdown was something that had never been done before, even during the world wars. This was to cover the financial collapse of the Federal Reserve System. This means that the Bank of England did not have the reserve requirements to continue as a bank. This is the same thing that happened to the banks in the crash of 1929. Deutsche Bank, the central bank of Germany, could not meet their reserves that day either. Last week, the Fed's bankruptcy ended, and so did their hold on global power via the US dollar. Hence, countries like Russia, China, and India are no longer accepting the fake US currency in international trade. They're not accepting most European currencies because they are also backed by nothing. Russia told Germany last month they have to pay their oil and energy with rubles. Germany has no rubles. This is just the beginning of the fallout from the decoupling from the US fiat dollar and the rest of the world. The euro left the dollar last week. Germany announced this week that food costs had increased by 25 to 50%. Leaders of these foreign nations that wanted out of the Federal Reserve System have spoken about taking down this banking cartel many, many times, but our media blocks the news. In fact, Putin says he is destroying the City of London Anglo-Saxon cartel that has enslaved most of the world for the last several hundred years. Both Putin and the leader of China clearly state the New World Order Great Reset Nazi plan will not take place. The Federal Reserve and the Great Reset are the same group of people. Funny how you never see this discussed on Fox or CNN or any other media outlets. One of the reasons we don't hear much about the global financial reset is because Western politicians, the military-industrial complex, and the media are continuing to implement the Great Reset agenda. To be successful, the Great Reset requires continued chaos, the collapse of the financial systems worldwide, and mass starvation. This way, this group of billionaires can bring about their new Nazi world order. This information is taken directly from the Great Reset meetings and speeches. Countries outside the Federal Reserve System with asset-backed currencies are no longer controlled by this group. In the past, they've taken down many world leaders to protect the Federal Reserve System. Hence the reason NATO and other New World Order leadership killed Saddam Hussein when he said Iraq would no longer accept the Federal Reserve petrodollar. 2 weeks later, he was dead. This same group killed Gaddafi. He was implementing a gold-backed currency in an African Union. Gaddafi was suing the royal families of Europe and their banking systems for trillions of dollars their nations had been cheated out by the European powers. Now our same global leaders are involved in these mass atrocities and thefts in Africa and the Middle East. These people serve the City of London bankers, and now they're calling out for a regime change in Russia. Does anyone see a pattern here? The currencies offered by many other nations are now gold-backed, and these countries do not need to trade in the bankrupt City of London SWIFT system. According to the Global Currency Reset website, or the GCR, over 200 countries are now in the new quantum system. Currencies are linked to assets. Countries are no longer accepting the Federal Reserve counterfeit money of the United States. Therefore, inflation will continue to rise, and not just rise, to go up dramatically. Our leaders will continue to try and start a war to cover their crimes and cover up the financial collapse. This group of bankers have started and funded all sides of many wars in the past to cover their previous crimes. They are doing it right now, right in front of us. Half of the world's population just went off the dollar. That is why there is a massive inflation. There are more dollars in circulation than there are buyers. The Corporation of the United States just lost half of their customers. High supply, low demand equals hyperinflation. So I realize some of this information is new to many of my listeners, and it can be pretty upsetting. I do not have a solution, but I'm just explaining to you the root of all the chaos over our entire lives. I thought this report by the U.S. Congress would be helpful in understanding the banking structure that controls us and our futures. So this document is titled The Federal Reserve Directors, A Study of Corporate and Banking Influence. It was published in 1976. We're going to go over the charts that reveal the linear connection between the Rothschilds and the Bank of England and the London banking houses, which ultimately control the Federal Reserve banks through their stock holdings of bank stock and their subsidiary firms in New York. The two principal Rothschild representatives in New York are J.P. Morgan Company and Kube Loeb and Company, were the firms which set up the Jekyll Island Conference in which the Federal Reserve Act was drafted, who directed the subsequent successful campaign to have the plan enacted into law by the Congress, and who purchased the controlling amounts of stock in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in 1914. These firms had their principal offices appointed to the Federal Reserve Board of Governors and the Federal Advisory Council in 1914. In 1914, a few families, blood or business related, owned controlling stock in existing banks, such as in the New York City, caused those banks to purchase controlling shares in the Federal Reserve regional banks. Examination of the charts and text in the House Banking Committee's staff report in August of 1976 and the current stockholders list of the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks show the same family control. So I'm just going to take a little time to go over these charts. People can stop and look at them for a while if they like. But basically, we've got N.M. Rothschild in London, who controls the Bank of England. And under that, we have J. Henry Schroeder Banking Corp., Lazard Brothers, Brown, Shipley, Morgan, Grenfell. There's a lot of names like Brown Brother Harriman, Lord Montagu, Morgan at Sea. They're the governors of the Bank of England, and they're also governors of J.P. Morgan, New York Morgan Guarantee Company, and Morgan Stanley. So you can see the connection to the Drexel Company. Anybody who listens to financial news or has any stock in a public company should be aware of most of these names. So the Federal Reserve Bank in Philadelphia is headed by Lord Airlie. Some of these people may have passed away, but their descendants are still in power. This is just an excellent document that really shows the connection between all these families and how they really control our country. So under Lord Airlie, we've got N.M. Warburg, the chairman of Hamburg, Kube and Loeb. We've got Henry Schroeder, Virginia Ryan, the granddaughter of Otto Kahn, or Kuhn and Loeb. They have Lehman Brothers in New York City. Now, the Lehman Brothers have a place in Montgomery, Alabama, the Solomon Loeb, headed by Abraham Kuhn. And that shows you their different holdings in Lehman Stern in New Orleans, Jacob Schiff. People might be familiar with the name Schiff. His grandson is now in Congress. He was sent by Mayor Rothschild to the United States in the late 1800s to collapse the U.S. economy and bring it into the system. So we can see that these families still have a lot of power today, as we see his grandson sits at the head of some of the most powerful congressional committees. And of course, we've got Paul Warburg. All these companies also financed all the world wars. You've got Mayer Lehman, Emanuel Lehman, Herbert Lehman, Irving Lehman. You can see that everyone's connected or intermarried between these strong Federal Reserve banking families. You've got the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the National City Bank of New York, the National Bank of Commerce, Hanover National Bank, and Chase National Bank, all under this umbrella of ownership. So the shareholders of National City Bank New York are James Stillman, William Rockefeller, Isabel Pilsey Rockefeller, William Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan. They have companies like the National Bank and Equitable Life that's owned by J.P. Morgan. You've got different mutual life insurance companies that are owned by J.P. Morgan through the J.W. Sterling New York Trust, and Edison, Shearson, and Sterling. Even Mercury Insurance, which is a company that carries my insurance, is under this umbrella. So you can really see the powerful connections between these different families: Rockefeller, Warburg, Rothschild. So that's just one section. We're going to do another section here from 1983, and this is the Federal Reserve Directors, an updated study of the corporate banking influence. The J. Henry Schroeder Banking Company chart encompasses the entire history of the 20th century, embracing as it does the program, the Belgium Relief Commission, which provisioned Germany from 1915 to 1918 and dissuaded Germany from seeking peace in 1916. They financed Hitler in 1933 to make the Second World War possible. They backed the presidential campaign of Herbert Hoover, and even at the present time have its two major executive as subsidiary firms, and that's Bechtel Corporation, serving as the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of State in the Reagan administration. So we can see that these families have people placed in high levels of the military-industrial complex, the banking complex, and that repeatedly they have interlocking board of directors and employment contracts. We'll get into that a little further along. The head of the Bank of England since 1973, Sir Gordon Richardson, governor of the Bank of England, controlled by the House of Rothschild, was chairman of J. Henry Schroeder Wag and that company since 1963 to 1972. So again, some of these names are old, but if you look into it, you'll find it's their children who hold these positions now. He maintained a residence in Sutton Place in New York City, and he was actually the head of the London Connection, and at that time said to be the most powerful, influential banker in the world. So we can see that J. Henry Schroeder, and you've got all these European names from Hamburg, the von Schroeders. You've got Bruno von Schroeder, Tiarchus, and these are some difficult names to read, so I'll just let you guys see. These are the graphs, though, of the interlocking directorships and corporations that are owned by other corporations. You can see people like Foster Dulles. People may be familiar with him. He was the head of the CIA, and then he has the airport in Washington, D.C. named after him, Dulles Airport. These people, this will be something we get into another show, but Dulles and George Bush Sr. were involved in another company called the Five Star Trust, where they planned to put their operatives in place as president for the 5 years as part of the collapse of the United States. So that's another story that we can look into. You can see the Rockefeller Foundation again, this Belgian Relief Commission. I'm not really sure what that was, but that seems to be interconnecting. And also, like they said, through that, they had powerful people in government who were dissuading different royal families and different politicians to start the wars that happened in Europe over the last century. They're into sugar, they're into cane, they're into all kinds of different companies. You've got the Cuba Cane Sugar Company, and it's really interesting because a lot of the countries that they had businesses in 1976 have since been collapsed, and different socialist type leadership has been put in place, actually bringing these countries way back in time as opposed to forward. So anyways, we see all these different people still going on here. And you even have groups like the U.S. Food and Drug Administration owning some of these corporations, especially the sugar corporations, which is kind of interesting. A lot of this has been run out of Sacramento, California. And you can see here you've got the Schroeder Rockefeller Chairman Corporation, Bechtel, all these different Secretary of Defense, George Shultz, Deutsche Bank, Avery Rockefeller, the Henry Schroeder Banking Corporation again. And then when it all comes down, you can see that Gordon Richardson is governor of the Bank of England, with Henry Schroeder connections, and Lloyd's Bank and Rolls-Royce. We've got the Federal Reserve Directors, another study of a corporate and banking influence. And this was published in 1976. And this shows the connections to David Rockefeller and his links between the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Standard Oil of Indiana, and General Motors and Allied Chemical Corporations that are owned at that time by the Eugene Mayer family, and Equitable Life, which is owned by J.P. Morgan. So you can see that David Rockefeller was chairman of the board of the Chase Manhattan Corp. And you see these different directorships. And this is when it gets really interesting, because you can see all of the cross family company, that really all these companies are really owned by the same people. You've got Allied Chemicals, General Motors, Chrysler Corp., Macy Company, Omega Fund, Squibb Corporation, the Olin Foundation, all kinds of different companies, FMC Corporation, Hewlett Packard, American Express, Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing, Northwestern Bell. I mean, you name it, these companies are all owned by the same people. Exxon, International Nickel and Canada Corporation, Federated Capital Corporation, Equitable Life Insurance, Federated Department Stores, General Electric, Scott Paper, American Petroleum. Some of these names have changed or merged over the last few years, but the companies still exist and are still usually controlling the industry that they're operating in. Another report from 1976. This chart shows the interlocks between the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, J. Henry Schroeder Banking Corp., and the J. Henry Schroeder Trust Company, Rockefeller Center, Equitable Life Insurance Society, and the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. So again, we see these same names: Schroeder, Rockefeller, Paul Revere. There's all different companies that they own. Again, you can see, just kind of breaks it down. And now we've got another 1976 chart that shows the link between the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Brown Brothers Harriman, Sun Life Assurance Company, and the Rockefeller Foundation. So the chairman of the board of Texaco Incorporated, all the directors of Texaco and directors interlock with other companies. You've got Arabian American Oil Company, National Steel, Brown Brothers Harriman, American Express. Just again, the constant repetition of interlocking directors and ownership. So I hope that helped people understand the Federal Reserve structure a little bit, and will give you a better idea of how to research the companies that you're invested in, or the different companies that now may be taken over by someone else, but still operated by the same group of people. I hope this congressional report has been helpful in giving people a better understanding of the banking structure that rules us, taxes us, and sends our youth to fight their wars. The information we just reviewed is pretty overwhelming, and it can be difficult to understand how so few people have so much power. You might be asking, what can the average person do about this situation? And honestly, we can't do much. But we can prepare ourselves and our families for the tougher times ahead. And part of that preparation is to turn off the news. The mainstream media is the primary purveyor of the bankers' plans to collapse the world economy and implement their new world order. The real news is that the average person has spent $5,700 more per household than they did last year to achieve the same standard of living. If inflation is the same as last year, that will mean that you will need $11,400 more in 2022 to maintain the standard of living you had in 2020. Not many people I know have had a raise that equals the real inflation rate. Oh, what we do know a few people who had a raise that equaled the real inflation rate, and that's the Federal Reserve Board politicians in Washington, D.C., who got a 20% raise. The average family is going to need to make some changes and adjustments to their cash flow demands and find new ways to make their dollars stretch much further. People are going to have to plant a garden, bulk shop during sales, cancel your cable, reduce your phone bill, buy secondhand, etc. This can be difficult news to digest, but the reality is that the more prepared people are, the better chance they will have to weather this coming storm and to preserve the assets that they have worked so hard to acquire. If you have hard assets like real estate or gold, you should probably hold on to them. Their value is increasing daily. Sit down with your family and review all of your expenses. Cut back on random expenses so you have the money for mandatory items during the coming high inflation. Families can learn to work together to make the changes necessary to weather the coming storm. People should not use fear or threats to bring about the familial changes, but provide a clear explanation of how and why your family plans to make some changes in their spending patterns and their lifestyle. I'm not a financial expert or a financial advisor. These are just common sense practices for anyone expecting rocky roads ahead, at least for the near future. Included below is a link for a financial show of Gregory Mandarin that can help people understand the money markets, their effects on the population, and give you ideas on how to hedge your bets against the banking system. Remember, the largest wealth transfer in history just happened over the last 2 years. The assets of the average person declined dramatically while the wealthy acquired that wealth. The current chaos and the deception will continue because the bankers and the politicians are busy covering their crimes. At the same time, the average person continues to remain unaware of the war led on humanity by the people in power. The Federal Reserve System, otherwise known as the beast system, thinks they own you. When society will no longer consent to their slave system, they plan to starve us. Henry Kissinger is fond of discussing this starvation strategy in his speeches, and so are many other World Economic Forum participants like Gates and Schwab. Again, we have history repeating itself. So that was a lot of information for one day, and I hope this explanation helped people understand the current state of the financial system and how rising inflation is directly related to the Federal Reserve's policies and the bankers' long-term goals of world domination. This was a call to action for people who want to prepare for the more difficult times ahead, because ignoring reality and cognitive dissonance will not help you, and it will not help your loved ones through the difficult times that the powers that be have planned for humanity. This group of people rules us under Roman law, and when we do not push back, that means we give our consent. Do you to consent to the plans for the rulers of this world have for you and your family? Because I don't. As always, this information is offered with hopes that never again will the truth be lost in translation. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your comments. Please like, share, and subscribe. This is Simone, signing off for today.